Is that saying not that people can't hear, no?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this talk. For those of you who are joining from India, it's just a few days after Diwali, so we appreciate you being here with us to hear Greg speak today. Gregory Randolph is a PhD candidate in urban planning and development at the Sol Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California and the founding partner at Just Jobs Network. Greg's been a collaborator of folks at CPR for a very long time. Before he started his PhD and he was working in India with the Just Jobs Network, we did a lot of projects together which explored small towns, urbanization and migration processes. And so we are particularly invested in his talk today and really curious to see what he's been finding in his PhD field research. So over to you, Greg, without further ado. Greg will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and please don't hesitate to put in your questions in the chat window. If there's anything clarificatory, we will try and take it up urgently, but we'll try and sort of stack the questions for the end of the presentation, and we look forward to a very robust discussion. And Greg's also looking for a lot of feedback, so please don't hold yourself back with your comments and questions. Greg, welcome.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mukta, for the introduction. And as Mukta mentioned, CPR and Just Jobs Network have a close working relationship, and Mukta and I in particular have been collaborating for about a decade, which is kind of crazy to think about. But so for me, it's a special opportunity to be able to share some of my research at CPR, and as Mukta mentioned, I'm particularly excited to get your feedback on this work, which really does build quite directly on a lot of the work on urbanization that's been happening at CPR, which I'll talk about. I originally, when I sent out the abstract, was going to focus just on some of the specific aspects of non-farm economic growth in my field sites. But because you've graciously given me 45 minutes, I decided to expand this presentation a little bit and talk a little bit more about how I'm conceiving of my dissertation work. I will also talk about the subversive non-farm economy in Begusarai, but I'll start with a little bit of a broader framing. So I'll be talking today about a phenomenon that I've identified and investigated through the course of my dissertation, which I call urbanization from within. And this work really builds directly on research at CPR on subaltern urbanization and census towns. And this work was in many ways the inspiration for this project. I'm going to argue that urbanization from within is a particular expression of 21st century urbanization, which is occurring under unique historical conditions. And I will pose to you that this phenomenon offers an opportunity to sort of rethink what urban transitions look like. Also, as a PhD candidate in urban planning, I'm going to talk a little bit about what urbanization from within might mean for planning and urban policy. And I'm going to argue that this is a really critical phenomenon for urban planners in particular to pay attention to, because it raises specific issues around economic and environmental resilience. So I just want to start by laying out a really broad sort of context here for 21st century urban transitions. When I use the term urban transition, what I mean is the period of a society's history when it becomes majority urban. And contemporary urban transitions, which are unfolding predominantly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, are occurring in a particular historical context with these three sort of mega trends: climate change, technological acceleration with both the third and fourth industrial revolutions, and also the largest demographic booms in human history. Of course, all of these forces have an independent effect on cities, but my interest is in how they reshape the landscape of economic opportunity and how this influence then shapes the urban transition itself. I'm not sure whether it's possible to close this bottom bar, but it's going to cover up parts of the slides for the folks in the room. Is that possible? Okay, I'll just keep going. So the central claim of my dissertation research is that parts of India, and most notably the Eastern Indo-Gangetic Plain, is witnessing this novel urbanization pattern that I call urbanization from within. And of course, we tend to imagine the urban transition as involving permanent migration of people to cities and their peripheries. But as we know, thanks to a lot of the work that's been done here at CPR, the Indian case shows us that there is a kind of a different pathway to urbanization. This doesn't involve necessarily overhauling the definition of urbanism. When I talk about urbanization, I am talking about the development of dense, built up and populous settlements with specialization of labor. Settlements like this one in the Begusarai district called Mansurchak. I define urbanization from within as an in situ urbanization process that occurs as villages grow and densify and labor markets and land uses transition away from agriculture, despite the net out migration of people. And this last part of the definition is where I'm trying to offer some new and additional insight in my work. Because we know from previous work here at CPR and other places that in situ urbanization is occurring in many parts of India. But the demographic conditions of this process have not been as deeply explored. I've organized my talk into 6 sections. I'll talk first about the motivation for this work and the research question that's guided me. I'll then talk about my research design. I'll go over some of the empirical findings with a focus on some of the statistical analysis, but also the fieldwork. And then I'll talk about the framework that I've used to interpret these findings, their implications, and some of the future research directions. So let's start with this issue that piqued my interest. So before I even began my doctoral work, I was living here in Delhi. As Mukta mentioned, I helped in establishing the Just Jobs Network, which focuses on labor markets and employment in India, as well as other parts of the global South. And we began collaborating with researchers here at CPR. And so I became aware of this phenomenon of dispersed urbanization in India and the development of census towns. And one of the key findings from this work that I really picked up on was this fact that reclassification had contributed more to India's urban population growth than rural to urban migration in the 2001 to 2011 census period. And this sort of led to a claim that I think has very important consequences for urban theory, that India's urbanization is driven more by morphing places than moving people. This, of course, is from Partho, Marie Helen, and Eric Denis' work. And to me, I read this as an indication or a suggestion, a provocation that some settlements in India were actually urbanizing without in-migration. But of course, reclassification on its own does not necessarily tell us that this is the case, because places could be reclassified once they reach the thresholds for the Indian government's definition as they receive in migrants. So reclassification on its own tells us that there's a dispersed pattern of urbanization, that there's a lot of urban growth in the countryside, but it doesn't necessarily tell us whether those places are or are not growing through in-migration. And so when I started graduate school at USC, I first of all was very interested in this provocation about morphing places instead of moving people, because I felt that it had these very important consequences for urban theory. And this feeling that this was a very important question for urban studies, for urban theory, was reinforced on my first day of class as a doctoral student, when one of my professors literally put up a slide that said urbanization equals migration. And I realized that this was a very deep, profound underlying assumption, perhaps stronger outside of India than among scholars here, given the context, but that this really is a foundational assumption in a lot of urban studies. So my research question was, are parts of India urbanizing without in-migration? And if so, what are the causes of this and what are its consequences? So why does this matter? Well, this is important because in urban theory, rural to urban migration is conceived of not simply as a kind of demographic vehicle. It's not just a kind of simple demographic process by which places become dense. It's actually thought to be responsible for a lot of the most important social and economic consequences of the urban transition itself. So in urban economics, the theory is that people and firms both benefit from this rural to urban migration process because it facilitates labor market matching. It matches people to the firms where their skills can be best utilized, which is to their benefit and the firm's benefit. And in urban sociology, migration, of course, is thought to be this process by which primary associations around kinship, family, caste, et cetera, are kind of eroded in favor of secondary associations like political organizations and subcultures. So the fact that migration is tied to not only the causes of the urban transition, but also its consequences in urban theory really raises the issue of whether this different pathway to urbanization might lead to a different kind of urban. So a quick overview of the relevant literature, which will be familiar to most of our audience, I think. But as I said, migration is really foundational. It's at the center of our theories of urbanization. Most theories of urbanization are constructed in order to explain why people move to cities. And I think this is because urban theory was in many ways born out of a moment of rapid migration to cities. The historical context here of, for example, the Chicago school being a context of massive influxes of immigrants, both from the countryside and from other countries to take up industrial jobs. And in trying to explain the existence and growth of cities, most urbanization theory therefore starts with that question of why people move to cities. This was a central question for many foundational texts in development economics, which emphasized this rural to urban wage gap, and again, saw rural to urban migration as part of a structural transformation that reallocated labor away from agriculture and into industry. And even when these theories were critiqued by sociologists, by political scientists, by demographers, their argument was essentially that other non-economic factors could also draw people to cities. So even those theories were starting with the assumption that urbanization results from rural to urban migration. And even the sort of urban systems models that have been developed in order to explain urban genesis, meaning the formation of new urban settlements, even those theories rely on the assumption that new urban places come into being through migration. So the classic 1974 article from Vernon Henderson basically constructs a model of urban systems where new cities form when firms in an existing city find that the benefits of agglomeration in that place are outweighed by the costs of congestion. And so they move, and then they spur labor migration to some sort of frontier. So this is really kind of our foundational model for understanding how new urban settlements form. So even those models assume that it happens through migration. And of course, there are many theories of rural to urban transformation, many scholars who have focused on this question of how rural places become urban, sometimes called in situ urbanization. But even these scholars don't directly deal with this question of the demography of new settlements. They're oftentimes more focused on other elements such as the political economy, the morphology, or the administrative status of these sort of places that straddle the rural-urban boundary. Also worth mentioning, not necessarily true of the work here at CPR, but most of the work on rural to urban transformation really does focus on peri-urban peripheries, as opposed to the kinds of places that have been explored in the census town research here or in my work on Bihar. What's interesting is that while urban studies generally relies on these kinds of old assumptions about the relationship between urbanization and migration, the field of migration studies has developed a much more nuanced understanding of how people move. And I sort of attribute this to two different movements within migration studies. One is the new mobilities paradigm, which came out of human geography and sociology, which really called for broadening the definition of migration away from just permanent relocation to talk about the many different forms of mobility, temporary, circular migration, long distance commuting. And they also show that in a 21st century world of advanced communication and transportation technologies, that people can maintain attachments to multiple places. They also show that mobility and connectivity don't necessarily equate to agency or power, and that many people who are on the move actually have no choice but to keep moving. Which was an important intervention. Separately, the new economics of migration really sought to move away from these sort of more simple explanations of why people move that rested entirely on wage gaps. So scholars in the new economics of migration argued that migration is really shaped by a lot of different frictions and barriers, and that fundamentally people are not making migration decisions as atomistic individual agents. They're making these decisions as really part of a household decision of how to allocate labor. So even though these scholars didn't directly concern themselves with the process of urbanization or the urban transition, their insights do sort of lead us to a point where we can recognize that people may not move from villages to cities in the way that this kind of classic foundational urban theory assumes. And also they sort of point us to the fact that rural places might actually be stickier than we think they are. That some people might stay in place, and other people might move temporarily but retain their ties to a rural origin. So how do I tackle this research question that I introduced before? Are parts of India urbanizing without in-migration? And if so, what are the causes and consequences? So my dissertation is very much a mixed methods project. One core element has been to operationalize this notion of urbanization from within and to identify its geography within India. So I used 3 different sources to conduct a statistical and spatial analysis to determine where, if anywhere, this is happening. And these sources were the census, the National Sample Survey, and the Global Human Settlements layer, which I'll talk about. I also have 2 other elements of my quantitative work looking at specific trends around economic development and land use change. But in the interest of time today, I'm not going to talk as much about those, also so that I can describe a bit more of the qualitative work that I've been undertaking this year in India. The second component of my work was really to understand what this phenomenon looks like on the ground. So I identified a case study district where the secondary data told me that this urbanization from within was happening. And my goal was to get inside the black box of this phenomenon. I wanted to talk to people, observe these places. I wanted to also ground truth some of the things that I had seen in secondary data. And I had a few core kind of guiding questions for my interviews and field observations. The first one was, if it's true that many people in these settlements are staying in place and that those who migrate out generally return, what are the causes of that? And the second question was, why are people leaving agriculture and what are they doing? What's the nature and the structure of the non-farm economy? And the third question was around the governance and planning of these places. What sorts of challenges and opportunities might be emerging? So for my scoping analysis, I looked at districts in India along 3 axes. I looked at migration, physical and demographic density, and non-agricultural employment. I used the post-1991 timeframe since this is the moment of liberalization and lots of different forms of socioeconomic change. And the reason I chose the district as my scale of analysis is because, as most people listening to this probably are very acutely aware, we don't have good migration data at the scale of the individual settlement. And so really the district in many ways is the smallest scale at which we can observe migration, the migration phenomenon. I measure net migration as in migrants minus out migrants as a ratio of 1991 population. And because public census data does not give us out migration data, I used estimates from the NSS and constructed non-farm employment variables for absolute and share growth from the census. And I did the same for the share of a district living in a dense agglomeration. And that's what I use the global human settlements data for. I'll talk in a moment about what I mean by a dense agglomeration. I also want to mention that because I use the district as my scale of analysis, this might raise the question of whether what I'm observing as urbanization without migration, so to speak, is actually people just moving within district boundaries. I did use a robustness check to ensure that that's not the case. I won't go into details on that, but if anyone's interested, I can talk a bit more about that when we get to the discussion portion. So I use the global human settlements to identify what share of a district's population lives in a dense agglomeration. I define a dense agglomeration as a cluster of contiguous square kilometer grid cells with a density of at least 1,500 inhabitants per square kilometer, or 50% built up area, and a total cell cluster population of at least 5,000. So the vast majority of places I identified actually have cluster populations in excess of 50,000, just a note on that. I'll also point out that this 1,500 cutoff is, of course, higher than what the Indian census uses to define urban. It's also higher than what a lot of governments use. But I intentionally used this more restricted definition, given the kinds of claims that this work makes, because I wanted to be conservative about how I was defining urbanization, especially in an Indian context where population density is high in the vast majority of districts in the country. Also, just to mention why I'm not using government administrative classifications for urban. I think the way I see it is that reclassification has really been an important phenomenon for highlighting the dispersed nature of India's urban transition, but it also constrains us in many ways. First of all, I think it limits our thinking about urbanization to a kind of arrival at an urban state, as opposed to looking at places where there are processes of rapid transformation in demography, the built environment, and the economy that are unfolding. And I think second, as we all know, settlement boundaries, not just in India, but anywhere in the world, can be quite arbitrary. And so administrative reclassification is highly dependent on where those lines are drawn. So as Van Down's work, for example, the Dutch geographer, as his work has shown in Bihar, when you have lots of agrarian settlements that are sort of all together transforming into a single urban town, the urbanization process can actually sometimes be very advanced before the majority of those places would be administratively reclassified according to the Indian census. So this is the reason why I chose to look at this in terms of non-farm employment on the one hand, and this dense agglomeration pattern on the other hand. And then my qualitative strategy basically involved filtering out districts that are urbanizing rapidly and have net migration that is either negative or close to zero. And I selected a case study whose indicators were broadly representative of this group, and also one where I could go and actually do interviews. I speak Hindi, but not any other Indian languages. And then within this district of Begusarai that I selected, I chose 4 different settlements to investigate. 3 of them are places with gram panchayats. They're still governed as rural units. One is a census town, and one has actually been changed into a nagar panchayat. You can't see all 4 there on the screen, but the other 2 are Manjol and Bakri. Bakri is the nagar panchayat. Oh, yes. Okay, you're right. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay. So let me get into the empirical findings here. So first is that dense agglomerations are growing rapidly in many parts of the country. Some of this is happening in the places that we would suspect on the peripheries of Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Chennai. These are all experiencing physical and demographic densification, as well as parts of Rajasthan and Gujarat. But so is this large swath of the Eastern Indo-Gangetic Plain, including parts of West Bengal and Assam. So these are, of course, parts of the country that are some of the poorest, some of the least industrialized, at least in Bihar. And I would also just mention that despite Kerala being the site of a lot of reclassification and massive growth of census towns, that it does not show up as a place that's experiencing this rapid densification of population and built up area. And so to me, just reflecting back on what I said earlier, I think this suggests that when places are reclassified, they're actually in sort of the latter stages of this physical, demographic, socioeconomic urbanization process. And this may not be the period of most significant change in human settlements on the ground. This is, this is the actual population growth. That's right. Yeah, I'm not showing it, but the map of the share growth in the population living in dense agglomerations it looks quite similar. And this same part of the country in the Eastern Indo-Gangetic Plain is also seeing this rapid growth in non-farm employment. And so this is generally, of course, considered an agrarian part of the country, but it's a place that is seeing quite a swift agrarian exit right now. Mukhopadhyay, who was a planner at Queen's University in Canada, he once called this part of South Asia a ruralopolis because it had developed urban-like densities, but on top of an agricultural economy. But the data from the census would appear to suggest that a lot of that agricultural economy is now shifting, and this is becoming a region that is much more dependent on the rural non-farm economy. So in order to identify places that were urbanizing from within to kind of operationalize this, I looked at districts that were in both the top quartile in dense agglomeration share growth and those in the top quartile in non-farm employment share growth. The reason I chose these metrics is because I wanted to understand where new urbanization was happening, new densification, land use change, economic restructuring. And so this map highlights 29 districts that were filtered out through this process, 29 places that are in the top quartile on both of these metrics. The ones in red are those that have negative or less than 2% positive rates of in-migration. So these are the ones that I'm claiming are urbanizing from within. The ones in green, which I'm not sure how well you can see, but they are essentially on the urban periphery of major metropolitan areas such as Delhi and Hyderabad. So we might ask how important this is to the overall urban transition. And so one indicator of this is that essentially a crude measure is that I added up the growth of population in these dense agglomerations in the red districts, those that have the negative or close to zero rates of net migration, and in the green districts. And we can see that, the population growth in dense agglomerations in this group that I'm calling the urbanizing from within districts was about 2.5 times greater in the period that I studied from 1990 to 2015. So I think this helps to further substantiate the sort of foundational claim that we started with about the importance of morphing places as compared to moving people. Of course, this is just one method of looking at and measuring urbanization, but it helps to sort of corroborate some of those earlier findings. But there is another sense in which this is not really urbanization without migration, because in these districts that I've identified, there's quite a lot of migration, as we're all aware, but it's mostly out migration. And it's also more likely to be circular and temporary as opposed to permanent. There's, of course, a chronic issue of really being able to measure migration at granular scales and measure the many different forms of mobility. But one kind of indicator that we can use to track temporary and circular outflows is the seasonal migration variable from the NSS. So this is defined as someone who's working between 1 and 6 months outside their place of usual residence. And it captures just one type of temporary migration, but it's still indicative. And in these places that I've identified, they have much higher rates of seasonal outmigration than the country as a whole. So this sort of suggests to us that it's not that the urban transition in this case involves no movement of people, but that this relationship between urbanization and migration is perhaps more complicated than what the sort of canonical or classic urban theories would tell us. Before I talk about my qualitative findings, I just want to give a quick overview of Begusarai district. So you can see that there's been quite a bit of change over this 20 to 25 year period of study. The share of Begusarai district that's living in a dense agglomeration grew by 10 percentage points and about 1.4 million people. The non-farm employment share is still below 50% in the district as a whole, but it's more than doubled over the study period. And the locations where I've actually been conducting this work have much higher non-farm employment than the district as a whole. So the census town Mansurchak has over 80%. The Nagar Panchayat has almost 70%. I also think that, so you might not be able to, yeah, unfortunately you can't see the bottom. Do you think if I change this that it might? Ah, there we go, perfect. Good solution. So you can also see, just looking at these 4 settlements where I've been conducting my field work, you can kind of start to see it reinforces this point about the arbitrariness of administrative boundaries, because Manjhol as a settlement only has 45% of its population in non-farm work, but the settlement boundaries are drawn to include 36,000 people. So it'd be quite easy to construct one or multiple census towns within Manjhol where the population is at least 5,000 and the non-farm employment is above 75%, which is the threshold, of course, for classifying a place as urban. So I think this sort of highlights that fact as well, why it's important to look at this through other metrics. So relating to this first question of migration behavior, I want to introduce you to Santosh here, who is quite representative of the pattern of outmigration in this place. Santosh is from Banvardipur, one of the 4 settlements in Begusarai district. And in his relatively short professional life, he's about 30 years old. Santosh has worked as a grocery store clerk, a salesman, a server, a custodian in a hotel, a restaurant host, and a cashier. He started off working in the nearby city of Begusarai, which is about an hour's drive from this place. But then he lived in Hyderabad for 8 months. He lived in Bangalore for 6 months. And essentially none of the jobs that he took up offered him scope of upward mobility or substantial wage growth, which is why he finally decided to move back. And here in Banvardipur, in the market, he runs a micro enterprise that's inside of another micro enterprise. This is actually his uncle's clock shop, but he started a CSC, a common services center, inside of the clock shop. And he also occasionally works as a fisherman on the side. So he still maintains this sort of link to the agriculture sector. And the capital that he's accumulated to run this business include a laptop, printer, and laminator, but he's accumulated all of them on credit, which he's paying back at quite high interest rates. So I think Santosh's journey away from home and back kind of mirrors the story of many men in this place. It's a story that's probably familiar to all of us who have spoken to circular migrants who work in large metropolitan areas or who've done field work in these kinds of locations. Their employment stories are really filled with a lot of precarious and low wage work. Santosh is actually one of the luckier ones because most folks who outmigrate from this place are employed in daily wage manual labor, in construction, and sometimes in agriculture as well in places like Punjab. And they keep returning to that destination. They're sort of locked into these patterns of circular migration. Many, of course, also migrate through labor contractors who take a percentage of their pay. So these low wages and this limited scope for upward mobility in metropolitan areas is also the reason why many and pretty much all in the case of folks who come from a social background like Santosh choose to eventually migrate back permanently. But I also discovered in my field work that there's another dimension here, which is place attachment, because I did speak to some return migrants who had actually managed to achieve quite a bit of economic mobility in their destinations. For example, I interviewed one migrant who had learned construction skills and then used those skills to actually start building Bollywood film sets and was getting about 2,000 rupees a day for that work. But even these migrants who were achieving better employment outcomes in their destinations expressed an intention to maintain a permanent home in Bihar, to keep their children in Bihar, their spouses, their parents. And I think that the sort of labor market, the lack of upward mobility and the labor market constraints in a lot of destination labor markets in India, they sort of combine with this place attachment and reinforce an understanding of the purpose of migration itself. And I think this is sort of encapsulated in a quote from one of my interviewees named Irfan. Translating from Hindi, he says, "How will we live there when our heart is here? We go there only for hard work with some goal in mind. Like in my home, there's a problem I need to solve. I go there thinking if I stay for 6 months and earn 10,000 rupees a month, then I'll earn 60,000, which is enough to cover the two debts of 30,000 each." So I think this sort of exemplifies how the place attachment combines with, the lack of permanent and stable employment in India's metropolitan areas and creates a particular understanding of what migration is really for. And this secondary data that showed that the rapid exit out of agriculture was borne out on the ground. One dimension of this is climate change. There is increasingly intense precipitation events during the monsoon season here. And my interviewees really did describe the fact that flooding has gotten worse and worse with each passing year. Waterlogging gets worse and worse. And one thing that is, I think, important to note is that these impacts of climate change on the agriculture sector are actually compounded by the physical urbanization process itself, because all of the rural road development that's happened in Bihar, it has provided a lifeline for a lot of people in terms of creating new forms of entrepreneurship along these roadways and at junctions. But it's also been done without planning for drainage, and all of the physical, the growth of impervious surfaces around those roads also exacerbates this waterlogging issue. So this is an important dimension of why people are choosing to exit agriculture. But of course, there are other social dimensions to the exit from agriculture. People also described, often in oblique ways and as a subtext of conversations, but they described wanting to leave a sector that still subjects them to quite a lot of humiliation and exploitation because of the rigid caste hierarchies in agriculture. Some of you may know that Begusarai is the sort of heartland of the Bhumiyar caste group, which is one of the most powerful landowning caste groups in Bihar. And many of the people who have chosen out-migration, but who've also chosen local non-farm work, have done so, at least in part, to sort of escape that system.
So where is agrarian exit also being accompanied with agrarian consolidation? Or
You mean like consolidation of land holdings? In my observation, it's being accompanied by mechanization, but less so by consolidation of land holdings. I think that particularly in the context of Bihar, where there are there's very few places where you can invest your money. I think people do like to hold on to land. Of course, there's some people selling land for consumption purposes or to fund a daughter's wedding, these kinds of functions. But in large part, people also see their land holdings as their only sort of source of investment and capital. And one thing I'll talk about in a bit is the fact that the land prices in these market towns are actually skyrocketing in quite surprising ways. But mechanization for sure. One of the things that farmers spoke about when I talked to them was that they've had to mechanize in order to cope with the labor shortages that have come from people out migrating and leaving agriculture to take up this kind of local non-farm work. So just to talk a little bit about the structure of the non-farm economy in these places. So first, I just want to mention that there's a lot of creative and entrepreneurial energy in the non-farm economy. In Mansurchak, this one census town, I spotted motorbike retailers, car washes, servicing centers, showrooms selling TVs, fans, speakers, furniture and sculpture artisans, a party supply store, a tuition center, multiple tuition centers, in fact, and lots of other types of micro and small enterprises. And of course, there's a nexus here between these new enterprises that are forming and the circular migration patterns, because it was often return migrants who were running these businesses, or at least providing startup capital for these businesses. There are some cases of very inspiring sort of skills transfer. So one return migrant I met named Rajkumar. Also, I've changed all these names just to be safe, but I figure it's easier to attach these stories to real names. Rajkumar had left home as an orphan when he was 12 years old. And he experienced a lot of the exploitation that's common among Bihari out migrants. So for example, the first 3 months of his wages after he out migrated were stolen by the labor contractor. He couldn't be paid legally because he was a child laborer. So the contractor was receiving his wages and then ran away with them. But despite these experiences, he ended up staying in Panipat for about a decade and working in a commercial bakery. And when he came back to Mansurchak, he borrowed some capital from his family and his networks, and he used his own small amount of savings from his work. And he started a manufacturing enterprise that actually makes the kind of commercial baking equipment that he learned how to operate when he was a migrant in Panipat. So that's Rajkumar standing there on the left with my research assistant, Anna. These are some of the pieces of equipment that he uses. His business employs about 25 people. Another pair of entrepreneurs I met had started this Maharanaji food plaza that you see the sign for there. And even this Metro Bazaar, which is the town's first mall. People call it a mall. It's a little bit more like a department store. But this was also started by a return migrant who had worked for about 20 years in a rice factory in Punjab. And when I asked interviewees during my fieldwork about why the growth of this non-farm economy is happening in some parts of Begusarai district and not in others, this is when the caste dimension sort of surfaced again. So of course, they talked about some things that are familiar variables for economic geography. They talked about proximity to roads, to rivers, central locations between two larger towns. But they also kept mentioning, multiple people used this term ekta to describe Mansurchak in particular, in terms of why the non-farm economy has grown in that place. And as I probed further to understand what that really meant, it was explained to me that a lot of the places that have these vibrant non-farm economies are those where the local zamindar caste, the bhumiyars, are the least dominant, and where these solidarities have formed between the local SC population and the Muslim population to sort of resist the intimidation and they kept using the term rangbaz to describe the bullying from the Bhumiyar caste group, which of course has a vested interest in the non-farm economy not developing, because this is absorbing the labor that they could potentially be using on their to sustain their own agrarian wealth. So the demographic composition of different settlements in Begusarai district, not coincidentally, actually has a pretty strong influence on the pace of expansion in their non-farm economies. So the two settlements that I studied, Manjhol and Banwaripur, that have larger Bhumiyar populations, have also the least developed non-farm economies, whereas Mansurchak and Bakri have the most developed, and also they have sort of the most pluralistic sort of caste and religious composition in their populations. So I think this is interesting because, you know, development studies theory sort of talks about the importance of non-farm and farm economy synergies in small towns. But here there's a lot more tension between the farm and non-farm economy. So starting a non-farm enterprise, even as a sole proprietor with basically no capital, which is a lot of this entrepreneurship, is viewed as kind of an escape from agriculture. And those who have agrarian wealth are, and I heard this in many different interviews, actually do not patronize a lot of these businesses. They will go all the way to the city of Begusarai and buy their goods and services from there because they do not want to patronize local entrepreneurs who are from lower caste groups. They're perceived as a threat. So just finally, despite some of the sort of emancipatory potential of this non-farm economy, I think it's also very important to mention that this is a context of very limited and constricted economic development. There is thus far very little evidence of any kind of specialization, cluster-driven development. There's almost no growth of tradable goods. So Rajkumar's factory is sort of the exception to the rule in that sense. And these are, of course, you know, the things that really underlie the wealth of urban economies. Also, as I mentioned, the local economy does depend quite heavily on credit and debt. And there's very high levels of underemployment. On the left-hand side here, I'm speaking to some men at a labor chowk in the district. And essentially, they described to me that they're lucky if they get work once every 3 or 4 days. Sometimes they'll go 10 days without getting work. And there's also a kind of bidding war, a race to the bottom bidding war that happens when someone does show up at this labor chowk to offer work, where you know, the person might show up offering a day's work at 300 or 350 rupees, and the men at the chowk will immediately start bidding down, offering 200 or 250 rupees for a day's work, which I think exemplifies the level of desperation in this economy. So whether or not we call these places urban, I think it's important to mention that their local economies do in many ways remain marginal to India's sort of growth story. Very, very little, yeah. I'll probably skip this slide because I think it's a bit complex and I don't want to run out of time to talk about some of the implications. So I think there are sort of potential implications here for both theory and practice. So the first, I think, contribution is rethinking the urban transition. And as I said, this is work that, of course, has already begun in a very rich way here at CPR. I think I'm just building incrementally on that. But specifically thinking about this relationship between urbanization and migration. So urban transitions are not simply produced by this unidirectional flow of people to cities. They can also be driven by populations growing in place while sort of exporting, arbitraging some of their labor across this, you know, expansive economic geography. And we can also sort of see, connecting back to that initial slide that I shared, that a lot of the sort of big macro historical forces that define the 21st century are kind of colliding in these places and helping to produce these new urbanization patterns. I think this work also kind of contributes to this debate in urban theory about whether we require new or separate theories to understand urbanization in the global South. I think in one sense, this work does help to substantiate the claim that some scholars have made that urban transitions in the South are kind of following their own historical trajectories. They're not just mimicking urban transitions that happened in the global North. But I also think that this work shows that some of the core theoretical relationships of urban theory between factors like demography, technology and climate do shape urbanization across time and space. So it's not really that these core theoretical relationships somehow collapse when we start looking at a global South context. It's really that these same forces can combine and recombine in new ways. They can interact in new ways to produce urbanization patterns that are different, that are novel. From a practice standpoint, I think that this work builds on the contributions from the Subaltern Urbanization project, in that it highlights a different context of urban governance and urban development. A lot of the assumptions that we make about the social, economic, political dynamics of urban governance need to be sort of revisited in this kind of context. So, of course, the places I study, like many of the census towns that have been examined in the work at CPR, are essentially market towns. They have very little sectoral specialization, and there are sort of serious threats to their economic, their ability to create economic opportunity if they don't develop sort of stronger tradable sectors. There are also places where these subaltern groups have amassed some amount of economic power, even if it's sort of tied to this very informal, non-tradable urban economy. And I think importantly, from a sort of planning and governance perspective, these are almost entirely informal economies. And so there's really a question around how they're going to raise revenues to provide public goods, which is sort of, I think, a kind of a key assumption that urban theories of urban governance often make, that there is some formal economy to tax and to raise revenue from. And then, of course, another dimension here is just that when we compare this kind of urban context to a metropolitan context, the migrant becomes a much less important sort of political fault line here. So when we think about the debates over employment policy, for example, that are happening in Gurgaon and Bangalore, where local politicians are trying to reserve jobs for locals, these kinds of battle lines that are being drawn between natives and migrants, that's a less salient sort of political fault line here in these places. Whereas something like caste, which of course still operates in the metropolitan context, but it's even more, I think, salient and important to the political economy of this type of place. So what does this mean for urban planning specifically? So I think from an economic development standpoint, one of the potentially useful sort of places for intervention here could be in promoting skills transfer in tradable sectors. So, the story that I shared of Rajkumar, I think a goal of economic development should be to make stories like Rajkumar's much more common. So I think there's a whole policy discussion to be had around what types of interventions that might require. I think from a land use and environmental planning perspective, the primary goal here should be at least to sort of mitigate the risks that come from increasingly intense monsoons, from flooding. As I said, the physical urbanization process is in many cases exacerbating some of those flood risks. So some basic forms of land use and environmental planning are required here, regardless of what the administrative classification of a particular settlement is. I also think, and I'd be curious to talk to folks who understand the intricacies of local administrative units better than I do, but I think there's a strong case here to be made for integrating multiple settlements, multiple currently classified rural settlements into single administrative units. So Mansorchak, for example, is a census town with 5,000 people, but when you actually visit it, it's really 8 or 9 independent administrative units that have all agglomerated together and entirely function as a single sort of urban economy and labor market. So I think there would be a lot of gains to be made from actually integrating those places into single units, making them nagar panchayats, et cetera. And then another observation, which I don't have time to explore in this talk, but there might be opportunities for revenue generation in the form of property taxation in these places, because despite the fact that there are very few formal economy firms, there is actually rapid growth in the valuation of local land. And I heard some quite crazy stories about small plots of land selling for half a crore in a place like Mansurchak, which, you know, one would need to investigate all the underlying dynamics that are making that possible. But it does, to me, suggest that there might be some scope for raising revenue in these places through property taxation. Mukta, should I stop here before going into future research directions rather than, because I think we want to give, like, I would really love feedback, and I know I've gone already for 50 minutes. So yeah. Okay, so I'll just stop here. I would love to get reactions. If it's relevant to the discussion, I can pull up some of these slides on where I want to take this work, but I'll just stop here and look forward to the discussion. Okay, sure.
There's a clarificatory question in the question and answer box about the representation of the NSS data at district level. If you want to take that and get it out of the way.
Sure. Yeah. So so this data was actually generated through a collaborative project with my colleague Arnav Datta, who's an NSS guru. And he tells me that this data is the estimates we've generated are representative at the district level. But I would have to confer with him to get into the specifics of the technicalities of how and why. But yes, these are estimates representative at the district level.
What is the
He is interested in more asking.
if you can paste one or two packets. No, it has to be green.
Thank you very much. Migration starts when the development procedure gets stagnated or it's not visible there. So the young population has to leave to get for better opportunity. So my question here is, there are two ways of development. One is by the government and the other is by the private sector. These are two basics. Well, the population has got its own intrinsic, strength. So my question goes, I am not concerned more about government, taking care of skill or development part. I am concerned whether the polytechnics, which are essential for development, any part of, skill center, because if the polytechnic is there, they can adopt any sort of new subjects to get the people, innovative. So I want to know when, Patliputra has been for centuries a big revolutionized Indian continent. So how far the education of polytechnic or engineering college are far away from Begusarai, because I don't know the demography. So could you please tell me if there is any institute, I'm not talking of a college or higher secondary, I'm talking of engineering college or polytechnic, if they are located within the vicinity of Begusarai. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not mapped the local landscape of skill provision institutions or polytechnics, engineering colleges. My assumption is that Begusarai, as the city of Begusarai, the district headquarters, would include those types of educational institutions because it's the third largest city in Bihar. It's a place with, relative to other parts of Bihar, fairly well-developed infrastructure. So I would assume that in the city of Begusarai would be the closest of those types of educational institutes. But it's a very good question. I should go back and look spatially at exactly how far it is from those places, because they could be partners in the kind of economic development policies that I'm describing.
Amrita, you can actually unmute yourself and just ask your question. I think it'll be much clearer coming from you.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much, Mukta. Thanks, Gregory, for your fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I work on rural urban migration from Bihar. So, I think a lot of what you're saying, I see that in my work. So my first question is, so we have two very different kinds of phenomena going on. One is this massive rural urban outmigration, right? Long distance, circular, like you pointed out. And then how does this urbanization from within speak to this rural urban migration, right? What is the relationship between two very distinct kinds of movements? Because even urbanization from within is, there's some sort of commuting which is taking place and so on, right? So that's broadly one question, what is the relationship between these two kinds of mobilities? And the second is, the primary data, what does it tell you about the extent of outmigration? Because, we know that the census is NSS and census really underestimate, migration, right? So, I'd be careful with the estimates, that's for one. And then, a slightly different issue, but I think where I find real synergies with my work is that you spoke of place attachment, right? And so, we have at the Institute for Human Development, where my work is based, we have data of 36 villages in rural Bihar, which are representative. So we clearly find that in places where rates of commuting are high, migration rates are low, long distance migration rates are low. So then what that really means is that that commuting does substitutes, you can think of them as substitutes. And then, prioritizing migrant perspectives is really important because, like you said, if you ask migrants if they want to go out, they will say, no, we would much rather work in the rural, in urban spaces in Bihar if there is decent work available, right? Then all of that also has implications for policy. Yeah, so just, those are a few thoughts and some questions. Yeah, thanks for your presentation again.
Yeah, thanks, Amrita. And I'm very familiar with your work. And so I'm really thankful that you joined this conversation today and offered your own insights. I would love to also just connect offline and talk more about the synergies between what I'm doing and your work, because I think, as you rightly pointed out, it does link quite nicely to the work you've been doing on migration, rural to urban migration of Biharis, especially in metropolitan contexts. So I guess let me pick up on the sort of three questions that you asked. So the first question about the relationship between this process and long distance rural to urban migration, circular migration. So I think what I'm trying to suggest with this work is that there's a very strong relationship between long distance circular out migration and this urbanization from within that's happening in places like Mansorchak. And I kind of see that sort of in two dimensions. One is just a very clear demographic sort of connection. I think when if we think about sort of circular migration as compared to permanent household migration has this effect of kind of emptying out the countryside in that classical sort of urban theory sort of way, where it was, I think, Kingsley Davis who said that urbanization is a process of the countryside emptying. So that really depends on a migration process that involves migrants moving to metropolitan areas, establishing footholds in those places and bringing their families. But as you've obviously pointed out in your work, that's not really the pattern of migration that we see here. And instead, the out migrants who leave Bihar are leaving their families, which sustains the demographic growth of these places. The reason why they continue to grow is natural population growth. The out migration process is not starving that process of demographic growth. In some ways, it's enhancing it by creating a viable way to stay in place while one of your or two of your family members are out. So I think that's one connection. And then, of course, the other connection is the one that I was trying to draw between the sort of non-farm enterprises that are forming in these places and the out-migration process. So most of the sort of non-farm enterprises that enterprise owners that I interviewed were themselves returned migrants. Some had come back after just 1 or 2 stints outside for 6 months each. Some had come back after 10 or 20 years, but there was a very common thread of sort of the non-farm economy being closely tied to entrepreneurs who are themselves returned migrants. And then some of that is sort of a social phenomenon. People come back to these places and they've developed a certain level of confidence, a certain level of interpersonal skills. They are, you can usually tell when you're talking to someone whether they've out-migrated because there's a different kind of disposition. So I think part of it is social in that sense. Also, they bring with them ideas about what sort of consumption patterns look like in cities, and they sort of replicate those, like the Metro Bazaar or the Maharanaji Food Plaza. And then, of course, the economic dimension being that the purchasing power is coming from remittances, that sometimes the capital to start these businesses is coming from savings from working outside. So I think there's a clear nexus. To speak to your point about commuting, at least in my field sites, I really did not observe too much commuting. I expected to meet a lot of people in these places that are going to Begusarai city for work, given that, as I said, it's the 3rd largest city in Bihar. It's about an hour away from most of these field sites. Some of them, it's more like 40 minutes. But this was actually quite a rare phenomenon. I encountered a few, but it was quite rare that I found folks who were traveling to Begusarai for work. So there was a little bit of commuting to these market towns that I investigated from the surrounding villages. I'm not even sure whether you would call it, commuting, because we're talking about maybe 1 or 2 kilometers sometimes, but that was a phenomenon that I encountered. And to your point about the migration estimates, I think you're right that if anything, these are probably underestimates of the scale of out-migration. But I think that speaks to the sort of broader theoretical claim that I'm trying to make, which is that this is a very different context of urbanization. If we can observe this degree of physical, demographic densification, the expansion of a non-farm economy in a place with such high levels of out-migration, then clearly this is sort of unsettling that very basic imagination that we have of what urbanization looks like. We imagine it as a process of people moving into places. I also tried to ground truth whether these are places receiving migrants, and it was repeatedly confirmed to me that people were not moving into these places. I usually asked my interviewees, out of 100 people who here, how many were born even in another district? And usually they would say 1 out of 100. So in-migration into a place like Mansourchak from people who are not native to that place does not seem to be a very strong phenomenon. So I think that reinforces kind of the fact that this is a different type of urban transition. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, no,
Thanks,
absolutely,
Amrita.
absolutely. I think it's really fascinating because we talk so much about the rural-urban migration, but I think this is a very important phenomenon. And I think the NSS data helps your case, right? It helps your case because it underestimates rural-urban migration. But that okay, and we can.
Thanks, Amrita. There are these 2 questions from somebody who doesn't reveal their identity. Otherwise, I would have asked them to come and speak. But they both questions. The one is about, have you thought about early stage administrative intervention for such urbanizing places? How can the government track such urbanizing places and intervene to convert them into urban bodies before they become dense agglomerate settlements sprawling across multiple rural areas? Another question is on the revenue opportunities from land, and that have you talked to panchayats and local residents about their interest in paying such taxes? And many times rural areas might oppose converting into urban body just to avoid paying more taxes. So if you can answer these, I think, because they're both more policy kind of questions.
So yeah, the short answer is these are really good questions, and they're both sort of contained in my future research directions. So And these are questions that I would really love input on from those of you who have studied, the questions of administrative classification much more closely than I have. I definitely think that the sort of the challenge of residents resisting urban classification, so as to avoid paying these kinds of property taxes is very much true. The one settlement that I studied, the Nagar Panchayat called Bakri, folks did complain to me about the fact that since its conversion to a Nagar Panchayat, they've had to pay property taxes. Most folks on the ground seem to feel that those taxes are not being used productively. At the same time, there are certain kinds of urban infrastructure in Bakri that don't exist in these other settlements, such as street lighting, a little bit better sanitation and drainage. But I think this is an open question, sort of what is the right administrative intervention for these places. I think what is just sort of obvious to me is that settlements that are clearly functioning as a single urban economy or urban labor market, that there would be benefits to governing them together. It's when I really started looking at the maps of what the administrative boundaries are in and around Mansurchak, I was kind of shocked to see just how arbitrary they are when you as compared to the ground realities. But this is a question I'm really interested in other folks' opinions on.
Put on the mic, Shumindra, because people are on Zoom.
They are as per 2011 census or the current one, because state governments they do sometime pull them together, merge into single entities.
Great.
It's substantial. Those criteria vary. Colleagues they have worked there. So are they old or?
This is 2000.
Do you see any kind of interest from the government perspective to pull them together into Nagar Panchayat?
Yeah, so I haven't explored that yet. I want to I want to go back and investigate a lot of different planning and governance questions by talking more to government. So I don't know what their appetite is for converting. I do know that that this Nagar Panchayat that I was investigating will soon be upgraded to a Nagar Parishad, and despite the reluctance to pay property tax, there's a lot of excitement on the ground about becoming a Nagar Parishad, because it's of course like a promotion. But I don't know exactly what the appetite is. I do believe that the Nagar Panchayat originally was born out of a combining of administrative units, but it's 2011 that I'm looking at the data for.
So Abhinav, you can unmute and ask your question. Anindita, maybe we can take Abhinav and your questions one after the other, and then Greg can. Is that okay, or would you like to do them one by one? Yeah. So Abhinav, can you, if you can unmute, you can ask your question directly. Are you still there? Abhinav Kumar, your question was about the role of agrarian capital. You want to elaborate?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
So,
Anindita, you've also been unmuted. I mean, this thing, so you can ask after Abhinav, okay?
yeah. So I just wanted to understand what was the role of agrarian capital in growth of non-farm sector, because a lot of these, let's say, upper caste bhumiyas from Begusarai or nearby Barauni will also be looking at these smaller urban centers, purchasing land there because they are anticipating that the land prices are going up. They are also investing in, let's say, some of these non-farm sectors. So do you see that kind of phenomena? And especially with land, increase in land price, do you see that there's some kind of caste angle also to it? Like Bhumiyas investing in these smaller towns because they anticipate that these are market towns, and in periphery, they will start purchasing land and the price gradually increase.
I can go next. Yeah. Thanks, Gregory. This is very, very interesting and exciting, because you have kind of put up a frame to what we have been seeing all along in the small city migration, small city urbanization. My question is actually following up on Abhinav's, and Abhinav is from Bihar. So I and Abhinav kind of keep discussing this land price issue all the time, because the small towns of Bihar, the Muzaffarnagar, the Begusarais, do see a very disproportionate land price increase for real estate, and we really don't know how to explain that phenomena. Whether property tax, circle rate, what needs to change the benchmark values for these cities is something that we need to really think through. And your recommendation on property tax was very interesting. So I thought maybe if you have any more light to shade on that matter. And the other thing is, I was actually taking cue from the person in the hall who asked the question that, you know, the social infrastructures, the schools and the education institutions and the hospitals and things like that also creates a lot of service industry in and around these small towns. And do you see in your research, do you see any direct link or effect or impact of the social infrastructure around these small towns? And do you plan to, you know, look through that side of the thing as well? That's it. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, these are both really perfect questions. So the role of sort of the agrarian wealth in the non-farm economy and in the increase in land prices. So I think that I expected to find a lot more intersections between agrarian wealth and the growth of non-farm enterprises, partly because work, you know, in other parts of India really shows that these agrarian to urban transitions often involve sort of agrarian, those with agrarian wealth sort of redeploying their capital into new sectors. But in fact, what I was told on the ground, and also what I observed in terms of the enterprise owners who I was interviewing, is that the local sort of landowning population, the Bhumiyars, are not interested really in developing their own non-farm enterprises. And I was told, you know, by my interviewees that in many ways the Bhumiyar groups sort of see running a non-farm enterprise as kind of beneath their station. Nor of course are they providing the capital for other caste groups to found these kinds of enterprises, because as I said, they often see them as kind of a threat to their own economic power. So I think, you know, we could attribute that to different kinds of really longue durée kind of historical legacies of the kinds of incentives that the zamindari system created, and just in general, I mean, Bihar is not a place where we've seen huge investments by landholders, landowners in you know, capital intensive agriculture to grow their wealth in agriculture. So I think in some ways it's not surprising that we don't see them making huge capital investments in these towns. But as far as land prices go, I think that the hypothesis that this particular you know, phenomenon of skyrocketing land prices, I think the idea that is tied to investment in land by Bhumiyars and other upper caste groups, I think is a very solid hypothesis, and one that I also hold but haven't yet explored. So I think if all of those who are interested in all of us who are interested in sort of understanding this phenomenon of rising land prices in these sorts of economies, I think if we all banded together to really try to investigate the underpinnings of this, I think it would be a very fascinating research project. My observations were mostly sort of focused on understanding the kinds of work people were doing in these places. So I didn't focus as much on land in this particular field work, but it's very much one of my future research directions. I'm really interested in understanding sort of the making of these land markets. I think the point about social infrastructure, the narrative on the ground is that the biggest change that is sort of from the state side, from the government side, that's kind of fomenting this growth in the non-farm economy is basically roads and electricity. That people talk about the connectivity growing, the sort of the ability to move around the district so much faster than they could before, the improvement in roads, and just this dramatic change in the number of hours of electricity that folks receive, going from like 8 hours to 22 hours of electricity a day just in the last sort of decade. So that's what people in terms of when you ask them about the development process and sort of in terms of state policy and interventions, what has been facilitating this process, they point to these factors. I did ask about health and education. The sort of narrative that I heard was that, again, infrastructure has been built, but that the actual quality of education and healthcare has not improved as significantly. But I do think there's potentially some degree of, there's some connection potentially between just the expansion in the number of schemes and the growth of some of these places. So of the 4 places that I investigated, I would argue that 2 of them, Banvaripur and Manjol, are places where there's been where quite a bit of the non-farm economic activity has grown up around a block headquarters, where there's a lot of people coming to access and avail government schemes, and the sort of the local market that grows up around that, both to service the government employees, but also to capture sort of the footfall, basically, of people coming to those places. But the bigger and larger non-farm economies that I investigated in Mansurchak and Bakri, I didn't see such a clear connection between that sort of public employment or public services infrastructure and the local market that had grown up there.
Harry, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself, since now we can put a name to the anonymous posts?
Sure. Hi, I am Harry. I am a researcher based out of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, and also an alumni of Soul Prize. So very nice to meet you, Greg. And we are working on something very similar for Rajasthan. So it would be very nice to learn what your research brings out and see like how we can learn one another.
Yeah, I would love to talk more, Harry. Nice to meet you.
You have a question? Yeah. Can you just take the mic and put it on? There's a button at the top. Yeah.
So I'm Hardik. I am from Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. So my question was that this process of urbanization, that historical one that we have seen because of that permanent migration, that we have often observed that has been a stable one. Like the cities that were formed due to that process have like survived over centuries as cities. There might be signs of decay in a few cities, like I find that in Kolkata itself, but still they have survived as urban centers. So in this process of urbanization, my first question is it that stable? Like the urbanization from within might be happening, but are there some signs of reversal, or there is some evidence of reversal somewhere? And the second is about perception. Like these cities that have been formed from that permanent migration, a perception developed very quickly around them that these are urban centers. Like you talked about Begusarai. I in my college have many of my friends are from Begusarai, but this process has been going on there, but none of them actually considers Begusarai as an urban center itself.
Even a city of Begusarai.
Yes, they don't even consider it as a city. So I think with this process, because this is happening, first of all, without a manufacturing sector and without a services sector. So this is quite a different kind of urbanization that is happening. So what is the perception? Like you talked about qualitative service, what is the perception about this urbanization being happening? Because I think that perception affects, because once this perception goes in the administration that this is not an urban center, then obviously they will not be inclined to give those kind of facilities that an urban center requires. For example, metro services or a bus rapid transit system and all this. So these are my two questions about perception and reversals.
Yeah, I think these are really good questions. So on the question of reversal, I think the way I've approached this is to essentially ask, for how many decades longer do we think that these places are actually going to continue to grow and expand just demographically, right? Because the main driver here of urban growth is demography, right? It's not, and it's natural population growth. And of course, India as a whole, fertility rates have declined, dramatically. I went and calculated for these 22 districts that I identified as urbanizing from within. I went and calculated how many decades will it take for them to reach sort of replacement fertility level based on, current trends. And it seems like they're likely to continue expanding their population through natural growth for the next 3 to 4 decades is kind of the average of these places. So they're definitely, their fertility rates are way higher than India's averages, and they will continue to be higher for the next 3 to 4 decades. But I think the question of reversal will become a very salient question in sort of the middle of the 21st century, because I think that at that point, natural population growth won't be sustaining the sort of densification, the growth of the physical and non-farm economy. And I think at that point, the survival of these towns will depend on their ability to generate productive urban economies that create opportunity, that draw in migrants like any other city. It may or may not necessarily be a good thing from a service provision perspective to have such a dispersed urbanization pattern. I think that's kind of an open question in some ways, but I think it's very much possible that there could be a stalling and a reversal in the next few decades in these sorts of places. It does seem, and this is to your point about, I think, perception. It does seem that there are places that are kind of reaching a kind of a critical threshold where they're considered urban enough that they're starting to receive more attention, more infrastructure, more investment. And I think those probably will be places that can sustain the sort of the end of their natural population growth. So Bakri being an example, it's sort of on the borders of multiple districts. It's already about to be reclassified as a Nagar Parishad. There's very, very early signs of certain kinds of sectoral specialization there. It's becoming somewhat of a textile market, actually. But so I think that could be a place that does sort of outlive this particular period of its growth. But some of the other settlements that I studied, I think there's less economic dynamism and less attention from government, and so it's an open question about whether or not they will survive the next chapter of their urban story. But I think from a perspective of governance and equity, I think that investing in certain kinds of collective resource management, certain kinds of infrastructure, even in the sort of less economically dynamic places, just based on their current governance needs and the levels of density, is sort of warranted from my perspective. But this is a very good question.
Hi, I am Pushpa Pathak. I did migration work long time ago. Is it on? It's on, it's on. My own work in Western UP, in a small town called Rampur, done 40 years ago, but I think the patterns are quite similar to what you're talking about now. And also migration work in the National Capital Region. I have two questions. One is related to migration pattern and land ownership and class background, and the second one is access to credit. So first, land ownership. In my observation, what I see in your presentation, I get an impression that it's the landless people who are moving to nearby towns and non-farm employment. Whereas in my observation, both landless and landed and affluent people would migrate to town because of different reasons, different aspirations, one for job and one for higher education, then higher order profession and becoming professionals. At least one or two members of affluent families would be in the city. So they have this relationship between city and the rural areas, and they don't want to give their land, and they don't want to give up that asset from where the capital is being generated. So these two processes go side by side. But I don't see that kind of pattern emerging from your study in the Begusarai district. Second one, the question is that this non-farm work that is being generated by landless people, obviously they don't have too much capital, very little capital. Do they access the government provided capital programs? In all the employment programs, there is access to subsidized credit for small scale enterprises, for self-employment. So like skills is one, and the second one is access to credit. So do you have any evidence of people accessing government programs for credit?
Yes, just because it's similar to what ma'am was saying. I was summarizing basically what you said, and broadly three kind of verticals that I see. The first is obviously very much the question of land, and within land there are several sub verticals arise. I think there is a concentration of land question, because at some ways when sky prices rocketed and some very specific people have the ability to buy land, it gets concentrated on something hands, and that is a social dimension. So that's one particular question, that how concentration and reselling of land in one particular case that drives up on it. Second, selling and reselling of land is also an exchange question. It's not that sales is happening within the town, because the money that flows through land transactions can happen between the nearest large town. People, if they have more income generating activities in a setup like this, they often have first thing to buy a land or make a house in the nearest large town. So a lot of capital flows happens through the channel of land and property transactions within the town. So that's an exchange medium which does not have a very right in situ effect, but the money comes from the town. So that's another big question about land. And third is this whole interesting relation between land, real estate development, and non-farm economy. I don't get how do we actually link these things? Do non-farm economy or agrarian capital, what basically contributes? Because it gets back from your very starting questions, the dense agglomeration, because at the end of the day, they are all built up growth and very much linked to real estate construction activities. So from what particular kind of capital is creating it? Is it what is the proportion of non-farm that is contributing to that growth? I think very few studies have talked about, we always take built up growth as a proxy of non-farm activities by default, but you have a good scope to quantify that, how much it can be taken or not. So the next article that in your talk that I find, and is the question of pluriactivity, which Jyotka and all these people have talked about. And sorry, what pluriactivities, because people simultaneously pursuing multiple activities on time. It may be farm, non-farm, or two non-farm activities at the same time. You haven't talked much about casual labor and that sort of setup in both farm and non-farm spaces in your spaces. So that's one particular thing you will talk about. And a lot of the self-employment, because one thing I find interesting from your work is that this caste representation of enterprises, which is very much also captured in data. Smaller own account enterprises have significantly higher presence of SC and ST owners. It's interesting that you find that in your primary stuff, but the question of viability comes there, that this self-employment is viable. So this whole goods jobs, bad jobs questions that people goes back and forth between that. So something on that pluriactivity setup, because central debate around rural non-farm economy in India is that it's not stable, because there are either you have to think about an inverted U-shaped curve, wherein x-axis you plot the nature of development happening, and y-axis kind of specialization happening. At left-hand side, you have very low level of development and low level of specialization. There you don't expect much non-farm transition to happen. As you pick up some non-farm activity, you start more development comes in, and you start to specialize. You reach a maximum level, and then you go up to the more specialized and more developed scenario. So where are these places created, for example, in such a curve? do you find them in between? And if you find them in between, what is the proportion of those kinds of pluri-activities? The whole of the transition state. The third is the question of specialization, which forms when non-farm activity really forms into a mature stage. And specialization, I link it back again to question of local specialization vis-a-vis a more sort of, so economics specialization. Something comes up, it needs to be an agglomeration, is a leather cluster or something like that. But specialization can be different, and a lot of this time in the subaltern work also shows that though everyday non-farm economies, they play a very important role in specializing the local space. So the integration to the local economy is a interesting question, that you have these 4 or 5 different towns. Any of them has, which you call something called textile cluster, any of them has any specific kind of activities that is going on, even that seems very banal in general, that has job generation effect, and that's very much linked to the question of survival of towns and all these larger stories, because it's always not, I mean, there are obviously difference in wage rates, people's aspirations, which drives migration. Migration is a complex question. We can't really tell about that. Commuting, substantiate migration, long-term migration. These are not really something that needs more stuff. But the larger question around it is that do local specialization create some sort of wage differential or a different sort of economic setup that creates a parallel sort of migration where people actually think of staying back rather than going back and forth. Also, the question of place of attachment, when I talk about land transition, I talked about this question of place of attachment and is related to land, because when people talk about place of attachment, do they try to buy land, and that in turn contributes to the whole agrarian transition story. From your stuff, I mostly see that you say there's a lot of money that's going into opening self-employment enterprises, but how the circulation of capital happens, because all of these things moves in circles. That's why my question comes back and forth. Yeah, that are the 3 main. I mean, these are not really questions, but points that I wanted.
No, these are really wonderful. This is exactly why I was excited to present at CPR. I knew I would get really rich feedback and suggestions for future research. So yeah, so thanks to both of you. I'll just pick up on a few things rather than try to go into every single point. But I think coming back to your question about the relationship between land ownership and migration. So I didn't touch on it as much in my presentation, because what I was trying to really tease out is the nature of this non-farm economy that's forming in these market towns and how that's related to patterns of migration and other kinds of social and economic change. But the pattern that you described in Western UP of out-migration of both types of people is very much the story here as well. I think that the out-migration of upper caste populations, as you pointed, is much more for education purposes and eventually for taking up professional class jobs. And I think for that reason, it also is much more likely to involve the permanent migration of most members of the household. And so the interesting, I think, piece of that is that when you have this happening over multiple generations, as it has happened, this question of sort of the demographic composition of a settlement also slowly changes to where the upper caste population becomes less demographically important, because they're the ones more likely to be out of the settlement for long periods of time, or taking most family members, or pursuing these more permanent forms of migration. So I think in a place like Mansurchak, the fact that you've had multiple generations of circular migration by folks who are either landless or who only own, their plot of land that they live on, not agricultural land. The combination of that plus more permanent forms of out-migration by the upper caste populations has contributed to this situation where the SC population has more demographic weight in the population, and therefore more kind of economic and to some extent political power. But yeah, I think that is very much a phenomenon. There's also, I think that this trend of sort of the upper caste population moving to the nearest town, the nearest larger center, is that is a stronger phenomenon than the equivalent for the SC population. So you have whom are, landowners who own a lot of land in the district, but their permanent home is in the city of Begusarai or in Patna. So I think that's also more common. Shumindra, I guess to pick up on a few things that you mentioned. So yeah, I mean, definitely what I was kind of trying to sort of point out in the presentation is that these, despite some of the, I guess you could say, progressive potentials of this non-farm economy, that it is, these are not just jobs. This is precarious, informal work. There's a lot of, straddling multiple different livelihood strategies, straddling the farm and non-farm economy, absolutely. And I think that there has to be, from an economic development perspective, a little bit more thought about what types of interventions would be most effective in these places. To pick up on your other question, most of the entrepreneurs that I spoke to had not been able to access credit from government. Some had accessed credit from self-help groups, but for the most part, their capital came from just informal networks of borrowing among friends and family, in addition to their own savings from migration, if they did have any. So yeah, I think the forms of specialization are quite limited, but to your point, there are sort of, I guess, locally traded goods. So for example, in Mansurchak, there is a quite vibrant community of murti artisans, and they do sell their murtis even to other districts in the surrounding area. So they've developed a little bit of a reputation for their sort of manufacturing work. There's also one of the other settlements that I studied, Manjhol, has I don't even know if you could call it a cluster, but there are probably 10 enterprises or so on the roadside that are selling these ghumtis, the little stalls that people use to set up shops. So there are very nascent kind of forms of specialization, but I think that you don't really see evidence. For example, one indicator that I would look at to understand whether these kind of proto clusters might be developing into more specialized sectors is whether they're drawing labor from outside the family, right? And it's pretty limited in that regard. These are still sort of family-run enterprises, and I didn't really see too much evidence that they were responsible for holding people in place. I think that the migration barriers people face when they move to destination labor markets are a more important explanatory factor than any kind of sort of development of specialized clusters in these places. But to be sure, there are some kinds of specialized economic activities that take place in these towns. And so I think that the policy question is sort of, how do we go about identifying opportunities for the best opportunities for growth, and then what does the range of interventions look like to promote those in a more targeted way than perhaps current government policies do?
If it is agriculture-based economy at Begusarai, so do you find any value-added agriculture product like fruits or rice or sugar, anything of that sort, which can bring some food processing or industry to these towns, and then they can get to the pedal of getting development. Do you can you sort of have a hunch or intuition like this?
Yeah, the only example that I found in Begusarai district is dairy. So it's the headquarters of Sudha Dairy. It's a big dairy company in Bihar. But otherwise, I didn't see much evidence of agro-processing or any kind of value-added activities in from agricultural products. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the questions can go on for another
This is great.
half an hour.
Thank
But
you all
we'll
so
have to
much.
stop sometime. So yeah, I mean, welcome to write in and connect with Greg. I can you can contact me and I can share his contact details so that the conversations don't need to stop after this talk. But thank you so much, Greg, for being with us here today and patiently engaging with all the range of questions and comments that came. And thank you everyone for joining. And I hope you all had a great Diwali and wishing you well for the rest of the year.
Thanks, everyone.